Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Q&A about business, innovation, and managing life. I see a bunch of questions saved up here. There's one from Anon saying, physicists who could code used to be the hot commodity. Is it helpful now? Seems like CS machine learning people, computer science and machine learning people are more in demand than physicists. Why is that? I think it's a complicated story because back 40 years ago, for example, sort of the people who went into physics were sort of the best and the brightest, so to speak. That was the top field. That was the field that was had brought the world, the Manhattan Project, the, particle physics, all these kinds of things. At the time, like 40 years ago, even 30 years ago, computer science was this strange kind of area, in a sense, that was sort of an offshoot of math, sort of an offshoot of electrical engineering. In some places, it was kind of connected to a business school. It was a funny thing. And what was taught there was sometimes very theoretical, sometimes very kind of in the weeds practical. And it wasn't a field which was getting, it had plenty of bright people, but it wasn't sort of a typical destination of the best and the brightest, whereas physics was. And so at the time, sort of if you were the people who were just generally kind of analytical, quantitative, kind of problem solving, they were often led into physics. And that physics for a long time, at least probably 70 years or more, has been kind of a very successful export field. People get trained in physics, and then they go off and they revolutionize or invent molecular biology, or they invent lots of things in quantitative finance, or they invent lots of other kinds of things, I don't know, in the space program and so on. It was a field where it was getting in the best and the brightest. The sort of training in physics tended to be kind of, yes, oriented towards computational things, and computational in the sense of you can actually work out an answer. It's not just talking about things, so to speak. But yet, unlike things like pure mathematics, which in a sense were very kind of oriented towards form rather than function, let's make sure the proof works exactly right and has exactly the right form. In physics, it was more like, let's just get to an answer by all means necessary, so to speak. And that was good training for many other fields. And that led to kind of physics being a very successful export field. Now, in terms of physicists who can program, that was a later thing. When I started in physics in the mid-1970s, I was very unusual in knowing how to use a computer and becoming sophisticated about that and building large computer systems and so on. That was, yes, there were experimental physicists who were doing that, but among theoretical physicists who were the main, I would say, the main supply chain for kind of export to other fields was theoretical physicists. Experimental physicists had a different kind of supply chain going into much more areas that were much more kind of building actual electronics and so on, kinds of things in the world at large. But in the theoretical physics domain, the number of physicists who could program was extremely small. I mean, ridiculously small in some ways. And it was sort of one of my personal meta innovations, was just realizing computers are useful. You should learn about how to use them and use them as tools. And then I started building those tools. By 1979, I was starting to build my own kind of computational tools, and that's what's turned into mathematical homomorphic language and all the things that we have today. But so being a physicist who could sort of solve problems, get an answer by all means necessary, and one of those means being the kind of huge leverage and tooling of writing, of being able to use a computer, yes, that's been a very powerful combination. I would like to think that our technology stack over the last 38 years or something has been sort of a mainstay of physicists who can code what they use to actually figure stuff out in the world. And I think the use of our computational language together with the general methodology of physics, get to an answer by all means necessary, so to speak, is really powerful. Now, what's happened in computer science and machine learning and so on? Well, what happened is probably in the 1990s, 2000s maybe, computer science in universities began to expand rapidly, and the domain of things that you could study and that made sense to study in computer science broadened. I'm afraid that in many universities, there's this kind of complicated sort of interplay between, well, I'm studying computer science. Why are you doing that? Well, because I want to learn how to program. Well, learning how to program is more of a trade, a craft, than computer science as a science is sort of about kind of the bigger picture, the theory, the architecture of things. And so it's sort of a funny situation because there is sort of the trade of writing code, and there is kind of the idea of sort of thinking about things computationally. Computer science as an academic discipline is an awkward place with respect to that, because a lot of the time it's like, well, I'm going to do a degree in computer science. Well, that's really just because I want to learn to program, which is not a traditional kind of at least elite university type activity. And for a long time, many of the elite universities resisted having computer science departments because they thought of it as a trade like that, as something like learning, plumbing or carpentry or something of that kind, and a different type of thing than the academic aspirations that they had. So somehow sort of the trade of programming became called computer science in many universities, and it's a lot of what people do. But there's this question of sort of how do you think about things computationally, not computer science, but sort of computational X for all X. How do you get to CX rather than CS, so to speak? Computer science departments mostly haven't been doing that. And that's still a thing that doesn't really have a great place in academia. It's sort of a funny situation because mathematics, for example, has pure mathematics that is sort of math for its own sake. And then mathematics as a tool used in a lot of other fields, and how that works at universities and so on is complicated. I mean, there was sort of an effort to have an applied math that would be sort of math that was going to be used in other fields, but that doesn't usually work very well as a centralized thing. There's kind of math as then the question is, do you teach the math as part of the physics of sort of a physics department? You have sort of a service course of math taught by the people who would otherwise be doing pure math for its own sake. How does that work? Or do you have a separate applied math that's kind of dealing with the math that can be applicable? It's a little bit complicated. And that has played out, that's sort of, I would say, still playing out in the computer science area. And I would say that the thing that I happen to believe is that CX, computational X, and the things that lead to that, that's the really valuable thing that people should be learning. The details of how to write code, how to set up, some Java environment, or how to do some particular thing, what gets taught has changed. Nobody teaches us, or very few people teach assembly language anymore. It's kind of moved to teaching, C++ and Java and Python and so on. These are all pretty low-level things. And, I think the important thing, the thing that's sort of the surviving thing that the AIs don't get to do for us and so on, is how to think about things computationally, how to formulate what you're thinking about in computational terms. That is not yet really what computer science departments have emerged into doing. And I think it's just not clear where that's going to land at universities, whether it's going to be a thing that computer science successfully gets or not. But what's happened in computer science in universities, I think, is that there is this trade of programming part of things. There's also theoretical computer science, which is a fine area, much closer to mathematics. And then there are various applications of sort of computational methods, various computational X's, like robotics, like cryptography, like essentially machine learning, which in some ways is a kind of application of computational thinking, computational X, But machine learning is a little odd because it requires a much higher level of math in at least many levels of working on it than has been traditional in computer science. I mean, many computer science departments were dropping requirements for students to learn calculus, for example, because in writing, in doing software engineering, who needs calculus? But in machine learning, at least done at a sort of semi-theoretical level, you need calculus. And so that's been a sort of an awkward thing. And actually, there's been a certain flow from physics into machine learning. But then there's also been kind of the computer science department now has to teach calculus again. This is a messy story. I mean, this is not, I think, a clean story. Now, what's happened is some of the kind of physics thinking has gone into areas like machine learning, partly because it had an importation of physicists, partly because its methodology is quite physics oriented. Many of the people who were originators of that field were originally physicists exported to that field, and so on. And I think now machine learning is a weird case because the theory of machine learning is well, it's not clear how much theory anybody knows. I mean, I worked on this trying to understand sort of at a foundational theoretical level what's happening in machine learning. But there are toy versions of machine learning that are absolutely amenable to theory, whether it's support vector machines or whether it's sort of some very basic approximation to neural networks. But by the time you get to the real used in industrial settings kind of machine learning systems, they're not really amenable to kind of, oh, yes, I learned calculus so I can understand what's going on types of methods. And so it's sort of the idea that, oh, well, we're going to have machine learning courses and they're going to teach things at the level where you need to know calculus is a little bit of a fiction because that level is a level below the level of what's directly relevant to actually doing machine learning. Because what's actually relevant to doing machine learning is at this point still a lot of kind of engineering, kind of folk information, experience, those kinds of things. It's much more a kind of slightly more judgment intensive version of software engineering. And I say slightly more judgment intensive because it's like you have to kind of understand the psychology of the AI. What's it going to do if I train it in this way? What's it going to do if I prompt it in this way? So it's a weird thing that I don't think it's not really landed at a theoretical level. But it's also the case that the people who've gone into machine learning early on are sort of some of the best and brightest of these times. And that means that the people who are sort of, oh, yes, I'm trained in machine learning are, just by the selection effect, are going to be people who are really capable of doing all kinds of things. And, the same is to some extent true of computer science in general, that it's been an area that's attracted a lot of very talented people. And so that's a good hunting ground for sort of export to other areas. Whether the skills that are learnt in detail are relevant to what you do next is not so clear. Just like in physics, learning, the details of Maxwell's equations for electrodynamics is not so relevant if you're going to go on and do molecular biology or quantitative finance. But the discipline of trying to understand how to think about things in those terms probably is useful. But exactly what level of abstraction and what level of definiteness is useful is not so clear. And in computer science, I know how to program fluently. That's clearly useful. I know how to think about things computationally, very useful, but not very well taught. The kind of I'm just going to get the thing to work, which is a lot of what one is doing if one's doing practical machine learning. It's not necessarily what academic machine learning is like. That I'm just going to get the thing to work. That's also a very useful skill. It's more on the engineering side in something like machine learning than on the physics and analysis side. So, this is a complicated area. Let's see. Let's see various comments here. Let me comment on the comments. Ryan comments, I find that building simple frameworks in software greatly helps understanding of the underlying material in math, especially. Absolutely. Story of my life. I mean, in Mathematica, Wolfram language, and so on, that's the way I understand things and have been doing that for 4 decades. And even in the predecessor system going back 4.5 decades, the it's you write the code, you can understand what's going on. You can do all sorts of examples. You can make pictures. You can get intuition for what's happening. That's really the thing that for me is sort of it is a way of concretifying and organizing my thinking. I mean, it's a little bit like the following. That You could sort of take it as an extrapolation of the following. In our brains, we've got 100 billion neurons that are all firing and doing their thing. And somehow, when we organize ourselves into having definite thoughts, we typically get to the point where we can verbalize those thoughts by taking those 100 billion neuron firings and sort of organizing them into, oh, I'm going to make words out of those and say definite things. In a sense, making computational language is another level of the same kind of idea. We're taking sort of our slightly incoherent thoughts and we're putting them in a form in computational language where they are precise and where, among other things, a computer can sort of extend those thoughts for us. And yes, that is, to me, an extremely powerful methodology and the one that has allowed me to do most of the things I've done in my life, so to speak. Let's see. Bit comments that they doubt that self-teaching cryptanalysis is going to be very transferable. I'm not sure. Cryptanalysis is a weird one. Cryptanalysis in its traditional form was very much a sort of puzzle solving type thing. And I don't know where that kind of puzzle solving I don't know what other areas of human endeavor, so to speak, are like puzzle problem solving. I know that in quantitative finance, there's quite a lot of people who were doing sort of puzzle problem solving. That's also true in microprocessor design traditionally. And it's also true in actual sort of cryptanalysis for a living in the intelligence agencies and so on. And that tends to be that's the place where that gets transferred. Let's see. Oh gosh, so many questions here. Hack is commenting, would you consider science communicator a career? What skills would be most important? I absolutely think it's a career. It's a career that's changed its character a bit over time. I mean, back in the day, it was like, I'm a science journalist for a newspaper. Then in the US, at least, not in all countries, but in the US at least, kind of for whatever reason, newspapers stopped being a place where people would absorb sort of science content. And then what started off was, YouTube channels, blogs, things like this. And there are absolutely people who are now making a living being science communicators, having popular YouTube channels, having popular Substacks, things like this. And in some cases, writing books that still go the traditional way in bookstores and so on. So yes, it's absolutely a thing. Again, different rhythm. Whether it's you're writing books, they take 2 years each to write. You go through publishing companies, things like that, or you're making a YouTube channel and you're going direct to consumers, so to speak, and building up a following there, and such like. Whether you're doing that as I'm just expressing myself, or whether you're doing that as an interviewer of people, building up kind of more like an interview channel. I think that what does it take to do these things? I mean, the personalities of people in these different areas are a bit different. So, there are people who write books where when you meet them in person, they don't say very much. It's like all of their extroversion is in their books. And in person, they are, they're not very talkative. And then there are people who are, some people who write books are talkative too. And then there are people who do interviewing where there are people who are expressing themselves, where it's a lot about themselves, as I'm doing here, kind of just it's out from you, so to speak. It's all you determining what's going on. To be a good interviewer, I think you have to kind of your ego has to recede, and it has to be more a task of listening to the person you're interviewing rather than being about I'm going to tell you stuff. So a slightly different personality type and way of doing things. I think that what does it take to be a good science communicator? I think you have to understand what you're talking about. I used to say when we used to have technical writers, we kind of stopped in our company having straight technical writers because what I discovered is let the person who invented the thing write about it and other people can edit that writing. That's a much better way of communicating the sort of the real story than having somebody who is sort of a layer of technical writer. But back several decades ago, when we used to have technical writers, my zeroth rule of technical writing is if you don't understand what you're writing about, your readers don't stand a chance. So that would be my first statement about science communication. You have to actually understand the underlying material. The better you understand it, the more you're likely to be able to communicate it clearly. Then, in terms of the mechanics of communication, somehow some people learn to write well and some don't. And I've never quite figured out what it is and whether that's a learning thing or whether that's a people who think clearly can write clearly thing, or whether it's kind of a learnt trait. I think it's a large part people who think clearly can write clearly, although they need to know some mechanics of, having grammatical sentences and things like that. But I think that's easy compared to the can you express your thoughts clearly? I think that when it comes to sort of being a popular science communicator, there are different kinds of hooks that different people use, and I suppose I myself have not been, for better or worse, much into those types of hooks. I mean, I try and do things like these live streams where I just sort of try and explain myself as best I can without kind of a lot of kind of shiny, what I might call gimmicks, so to speak. But there are other people who have a much more of a kind of a I don't know, a particular sort of shtick that has some particular consumer communication, and that's something which, again, depending on the person, if you're a person who is great at just doing sort of cool physical things and going places and so on, then your YouTube channel can have you doing experiments or showing things and so on. If you're a person like me who couldn't get an actual physical experiment to work most of the time, then that's not a thing to do on your YouTube channel. But in terms of sort of the career side of science communication, I would say my impression is that there's quite an appetite for good science communication. It has moved away from the newspapers and magazines and more into kind of online media. But it's actually something that is in a sense the better for it, perhaps, because there aren't the same kinds of institutional structures that you have to kind of climb through to get to the point where you're actually doing the science communications. Let's see. Let's see. Lousy asks, how would you think about approaching school in the age of AI and LLMs? Should Lousy, as a university student, embrace AI and LLMs, or should I avoid them to eliminate risks of being too dependent on technology? Embrace the tools that you have available and that you will have available in the future. Tools let you get further. Tools are leverage. If there is a tool that you can expect to use in the future, start using it now and learn to use it well, because you'll be able to get further with it both now and in the future. In terms of AI and LLMs, there are absolutely uses for those things. In It depends on what you're doing. If you're a college student and you're supposed to be learning a bunch of material, feed that material to an LLM and tell the LLM, ask me questions about this. It's a good way to make sure you know the material. Or if you're trying to, you're reading some whole thing and you're like, I want a summary of this, ask the LLM to summarize it. If you ask the LLM to solve your homework for you, well, particularly if it's calling our tools, for example, underneath, it'll probably get the right answer. I'm not sure that that's by the time you're just writing your essays, doing your homework with an LLM, it's like kind of you're out of the loop. And that's probably not the thing that's going to be the most useful. But using these things as tools to let you do more is absolutely useful. I mean, for example, I'm about to embark on a project which involves basically surveying hundreds of thousands of papers in the academic literature to try and figure out whether people have figured out certain kinds of things. I can't read all those papers. Just searching for keywords isn't enough. I'm hoping that LLMs can help me sort of extract the themes from those papers. And that's, I think, a good use for LLMs, at least I hope so. It's something where I'm kind of using them to fuel things that I'm otherwise doing. And I think that's a really worthwhile thing to do. And as I say, things like get the LLM to help you revise for your test type thing, those kinds of use cases, and there are many others, are great. I think, getting the LLM to write the thing that you're going to hand in as your essay, well, then you might as well just sort of abdicate in favor of the LLM to begin with. But using the LLM as a tool to get further, absolutely worthwhile. And the concept that you become dependent on those tools, well, we've all become dependent on a great many tools, and from computers on, so to speak. And I think that is the nature of progress in civilization, that tools get created and we start to rely on those tools. And we can fairly assume that, unless civilization comes to an end, those tools will continue to be available to us. Let's see. Leon says, I did specialized things for the government and just got laid off, and there are no similar jobs in the public sector. How can or should I pivot? I have a theory about these things, and it is that a job has some external manifestation, but it has a core set of skills that are needed to be successful in it. And that core set of skills tends to be more retargetable than you might think. I mean, in we were talking earlier about sort of school and things like that, and things like math problem solving. Well, if you're a great school math problem solver, you might say, gosh, what am I going to do when I'm grown up? There aren't very many jobs. I listed a few of them that are specifically math problem solving. In fact, there are almost none that are specifically math problem solving. But you say, well, what was the core skill that was associated with math problem solving? Is it I jump into something and I'm figuring stuff out really quickly and I'm racing ahead of everybody else? And that's what my key skill is, in which case there are many jobs, whether it's being a trader or being all kinds of things that make use of the just jump in and solve problems quickly type skill. Another thing would be, it's about kind of doing things where you're, for example, remembering lots of kind of tricks for how to do things. There are different kinds of jobs for which that's relevant. So my theory of this is, understand, roll back a bit from the specific job you were doing to kind of the underlying skills that you have. So, for example, in my own case, I'm always curious, what am I actually any good at doing? Well, there are things that, I built a lot of big systems in my time. I've tried to figure out a bunch of science. What I realized at some point is that if you try and summarize, what am I good at? The answer is I'm good at taking a complicated set of things, trying to sort of drill down to find the essential thematic elements underneath, and then build up sort of from an engineering point of view from those primitives to a sort of bigger system that's useful. that's a skill of mine. And you can take that core skill and you can apply it to doing science, you can apply it to building large software systems, you can apply it to some kinds of things with organizations and so on. It's applicable in a bunch of different places. The core skill is that one of sort of drill down, then build up type thing. And you might have thought, oh, that's just a skill relevant for doing, let's say, natural science. But actually, it's a much more transferable skill than you might expect. And even skills like, well, either I'm doing a thing where I jump in and figure stuff out in an hour, that's sort of a meta skill, or I do projects where they're going to take 2 years and I organize myself to do a 2-year project. That's another kind of meta skill. And those meta skills aren't necessarily so easy to learn and aren't really so accessible to everybody. And that's the thing where if you have one of those skills, there are lots of things that you can apply them to. I think in, you know, it is, I've been wondering actually, as people leave the US federal government, what will those people end up doing? Because there clearly are lots of skilled people, and maybe the government will get a bit smaller, and then what are they going to do? I have to say, and this is not what I'm suggesting for the US situation, but I remember after the fall of the Berlin Wall, visiting what was then newly Russia, and the question was, what would all these people who were, the party people, the KGB people, all this kind of thing, what would they end up doing? And I have to say, it was a little bit strange to me, was that all those people who'd been, I wouldn't say spying on the West, but maybe they were, had sort of rethemed themselves as now being kind of middle people, sort of East meets West type sort of business enablers. I'm not sure how that played out in later years, but it was sort of an interesting thing. Again, very different from the US situation. I just mentioned it as sort of a curious historical data point of you might have wondered, what happened to all those people in the former Soviet Union. And I think that's, at least in the early years, that's what happened. Very different from the US situation. I just mentioned it as a historical point. Let's see. Nodal is asking, is it better to stay at one job and move up the ladder over decades, like people's parents often did, or to adopt the trend of staying at a company for no more than 3 years before salary shopping elsewhere? It varies a bit with different parts of the country and different and things. I don't know. I think that there are times and places where there are companies, I like to think my company is an example of this, where the company is always growing and doing new and different things, and where there are really long-term careers that can meaningfully be had. There are other places where the company is just going to do one thing all the time. Now, for some people, having a job where you just do one thing all the time is nice because it's a stable thing. You know what to expect. It's kind of, you can sort of put your energy into other parts of your life potentially without having to think about what's going to happen in my job. I think, it is a quite personality dependent thing. But the idea of kind of, there is a certain, I don't know, samurai type approach where it's kind of like you work for one master for a little while and then you work for another one. And it's, where, for example, let's say you're in software engineering, it's like, well, I can do software engineering for company A, or I can do it for company B, or I can do it for company C, but I'm always just doing the same software engineering. I'm kind of a plug compatible employee who can move from one company to another. I don't know what to say about that. I think it's nice when you have an occupation that can really grow over time rather than being sort of in this plug compatible mode. Of course, in the plug compatible mode, the companies you work for might get to be different and more exciting because they're in different industries. And maybe you pick an industry where suddenly you're just doing that IT programming, but suddenly it's in a company where IT programming is a central story and you're sort of a central employee and the whole thing sort of goes to the moon and you go with it type thing. I think that, as I say, the attitude towards these things is a bit different in different parts of the country. In the US, for example, like in Silicon Valley, it's really common to do the job hopping type of thing, at least in some companies. in other places and in other parts of the world, it's much less common, and much more people expect to stay in a job for a really long period of time. I think it's, as I say, if you're in an organization where you get to do new things over time, then you kind of have the best of both worlds. You have the stability of one organization that you get to know and so on, but you also have the sort of excitement of doing new things. Now, again, it's a personality dependent thing because some people, you put them in one place for a long time and eventually they kind of molder. And it's like, yeah, well, I do this, but I've always been doing this. And they don't, and then when they go somewhere else or they start doing something different, suddenly they come alive again. A decade, 2 decades later, it's like, wow, I just woke up again and I'm doing interesting things. I mean, I have to say, in my own life, I've ended up in situations where, I've sort of been doing the same thing for a number of years, and then something new comes along, and I feel a lot younger when the new thing has come along, and when I start doing something different, and but that's me, and it's not everybody works that way. Um, let's see. Uh, Desk asked, do you see any solution to the iron law of oligarchy on the scale of generations? I don't know what that law is. I would have to guess. And I think the thing to understand about sort of the progression through generations is that you know people learn from the environment they find themselves in. And if that's an environment where everybody is doing amazing stuff, then they'll kind of get to the point where they expect to do amazing stuff. And it's not because they had some specific advantage of, they got this particular this or that thing. It's the ambience of, well, people are doing amazing stuff. And so that's just what one does. I mean, I think that if you've been around, I don't know if your parents or people a bunch are entrepreneurs, it tends to be like, a natural thing to imagine being an entrepreneur. If you're far away from that and nobody ever kind of did something that was sort of going from nothing to something, then it's like, my gosh, going from nothing to something, that must happen somewhere else. I've never seen that happen. I know a funny experience that I've had many times when I interact with kids, for example, and they happen to be, as many kids are, Wolfram Alpha users, and they, learn my name, and they kind of think, how come there's this product called Wolfram Alpha, and your name is, is Wolfram type thing, and then they sort of realize, wait a minute, that means this person had, somebody made that product. It was a thing, a human actually made that thing. Whereas to a lot of people, it's like products get made somewhere in the distance. It's not something where you ever get to see it happen. And I think that kind of the ambience of sort of doing things like seeing ideas go from just an idea to a big thing in the world, if you've seen that a bunch of times, you kind of internalize that. And it's like, oh, that's a thing I do. And, I think that's as much as anything, that's, when you see sort of generations of people who are many generations of lawyers, doctors, whatever, entrepreneurs, academics, and so on, I think it is quite often the just sort of the ambience of expectations rather than, and the ambience of what people are used to, rather than the specifics of, oh, this person had this opportunity there and there and there. Now, I have to say, it is a pet peeve of mine, having worked quite a bit on sort of education and kids and so on, that it is awfully difficult in the US right now, the kind of the stratum of people that sort of interact with kind of I don't know, the kind of educational opportunities that we try to provide in our, summer research program for high school students or whatever else, the kind of people who interact with that, and sort of there's a certain sort of segment of society that interacts with that, and there's a big segment of society that doesn't, and it's awfully hard to reach that other segment of society. Having tried in all sorts of different ways, it's something I've never been able to sort of scale that cliff. So that's a sense in which there is a separation, and I think it's partly a separation again, related to sort of ambient experience, because if you're in some, rural high school somewhere and people say, well, there's this cool stuff you can do in the tech industry, it feels like something very far away. It doesn't feel like something that you yourself can do. Now, occasionally people will be like, yep, I'm going to learn about this and I'm going to do it, which is great. And, people like me try and enable that when, and make channels for making that possible. But it seems to happen a lot less than one would like. And it seems like it's very hard to reach out in those directions. So that's something, it's a pet peeve of mine that it seems like, particularly in the US, maybe it's true, I have less experience in other countries, this kind of separation of segments of society, which I just think it's a pity. I mean, not everybody who, it's not to say that there's anything particularly more noble or anything about, being a scientist or a tech industry person than, being, I don't know, a farmer or a person, working a factory or something like that. But it's different. And the question is, can the folks who are in the ambience of one of those things kind of, do they even know what's happening on the other side of the fence, so to speak? And if they know, and if they really decide, yeah, it's not for me, then then so be it. But to at least have that opportunity seems like a good thing. And I think the lack of motion there is as much a matter of not understanding and internalizing the opportunities as it is actual barriers to being able to get there from here, so to speak. I think I would say, well, gosh, I don't know what. Uh, as I say, I think there's more of an effect along those lines than there is the pure, this group sort of leaves lots of money to the next generation. I mean, I think often the leaves lots of money to the next generation illustrates the negative value of money, so to speak, because it doesn't actually work that well. I mean, it's non-trivial to have that work well and not just be, well, gosh, I'm inheriting lots of money, so what am I going to do with my life type thing. That's in some ways, it looks like a good deal because, my gosh, then you don't have to do all that hard work type thing. But at another level, it can be a really bad deal because it's like, well, what am I going to do with my life? I can't think of anything type thing. Doesn't always happen that way, but it's a thing where, where again, it's sort of, it does happen with some frequency, and it's not a kind of an immediate, oh, it's going to be a win type thing. Um, the Let's see. Booney is commenting, how do we break the mold? They're saying I'm in Northeast England, deprived region, and asking about advice to children aged 15 and 20 to kind of realize their potential. The common thing, particularly in the American way, I think in many countries now, is like, okay, go to college, because that's sort of that's the thing, that's the mixing pot of of kind of see the world type thing. I mean, I think in past generations it might have been join the army, and is still in some countries, but it's still it's kind of a thing where it's kind of the see what's out there type thing. Now, not all colleges do that well at that. There's that varies, and not all people who even go to terrific colleges end up doing that. They can go to a terrific college and just, be there in a very blinkered way and not find out what's possible. But I think it's, that's a traditional answer to that. But I always think that part of the challenge is just thinking that there is a challenge, so to speak. It's like you've got certain skills, you've got certain interests. What are the things that are a match between you and the world about what you can do? And then once you've found that match, you've got to have the confidence and the energy to go and pursue that match. Whether that match starts as a hobby or starts as oh, I'm going to go take a job doing this or that, or I'm going to take this class doing this or that. It's some of those things are easier, like I'm going to take a class about this or that. That's a pretty low initiative thing to try to do. I mean, it's not something where you're going to say, I'm going to start a business. I'm going to start something where I'm going from nothing to something, and it's all on me. In the case of going to a class, it should be the teacher of the class who's kind of like pulling you along rather than all of the energy having to come from inside you. And I think, that's a way to sort of try stuff out. But then, sometimes there's a well-defined track. It's like, okay, there's this thing, you can do it. You just sign up to do it. And sometimes it's kind of like, well, there's this thing I'd like to do, but doesn't really exist in the world. And to do it, I have to invent it, so to speak. That's a higher bar to get over. And it's something, I don't know, in my own life, I was fortunate enough to start doing things which were, required some initiative, like writing physics papers when I was 15 years old or something, and required some initiative, required some, I don't really care what other people think, I'm just going to do this type thing. But having had some success and some of those lines, it really made it a lot easier to do a lot of other things where people were like, where if you'd ask people, or I thought to myself, am I going to succeed at this? It was just like, yeah, I'm confident. I'm going to succeed. I'm just going to do it, rather than kind of worrying, is this something I can possibly succeed at? So I think it's really an interesting exercise to think, what is it that you have skills for? What is it that you're interested in? Even if at the beginning you're like, there's no place in the world where anybody cares about those interests or those skills. It's often, if you think about it and be a little bit creative sometimes, and maybe do a bit of research and so on, you find, my gosh, there is a place where people care about those particular skills, those particular interests. Oh, that's a direction I can go in. But I think also there's again, this question of, do you really sort of reach to do something that will be, that's very ambitious? Do you do something that's personally fulfilling to you, but not necessarily ambitious in the world at large? These are all personality dependent things. I mean, I think that to be doing things even to be doing things which you, quotes, like to do every day. Some people like to be doing things that are hard every day. I mean, for myself, I am always doing stuff that's really pretty hard. And, I like having done it. Sometimes the doing of it is like, this is a lot of work. I'm pushing really hard, but I'm motivated enough by wanting to have done it, so to speak. I've done it because I'm trying to figure something out, because I'm trying to build something, whatever else, that I get over at this moment, at this hour, it's kind of a big grind to get further. But I think, different people have different kind of objectives in that regard. And sometimes it's, I see people where it's like, yeah, they're very capable, and if they had decided they were going to achieve, they could have gone a long way, but they don't want to do that. They're very happy being very capable and being more modest in their kind of worldly ambitions, so to speak, and just doing a thing that they find fulfilling. And I don't think one can say, at least I don't feel like I can say, that that's a worse thing to do than to have done sort of the grand, ambitious thing that has lots of visibility in the world. I mean, sometimes it's a complicated dynamic, but particularly between parents and children and so on, of like, it's cool for the parent to be able to say, look, my kid did this amazing thing in the world. Although I think it's cool for the parent to be able to say, look, my kid is having a nice life type thing, whether or not, their name is in lights in some place or another. But I think that's and there are people where there's sort of, sometimes there's capability, but not ambition. There's ambition, but not capability. And, these can work out in different ways. I mean, sometimes the ambition, but not the capability, so to speak, sometimes that turns into people who run companies where the other people have the capability and they just have the ambition, so to speak, and that can work out fine. Sometimes it doesn't end so well. Sometimes it ends with sort of the bitterness for the fact that the ambition to do something was there, but they never got it done, so to speak. And that's a shame when that happens. But anyway, a few thoughts along these lines. I mean, I think, Yeah. Let's see. Um, there's comments about economic barriers to success and fields where someone could be successful and where they do and don't need expensive education. Yeah, I mean, it's a funny thing. There are lots of fields. There are fields that have gatekeeping. You want to be a doctor. You've got to actually, do the MCATs, go to medical school, do this or that. You want to be a lawyer, you have to eventually pass the bar exam and so on. You want to do, be an engineer. You have to do your certifications for that and so on. It's probably a good thing for the world that those things are in place. Otherwise, bridges will be falling down all the time, and all sorts of terrible things will be happening. It's useful to society that there are these gatekeeping features. But obviously, to get over that gatekeeping feature, if you're going to be in one of those sort of managed professions, takes a whole bunch of education and takes a bunch of resources to be able to do that education when you're not, when you're just doing the education, not getting paid to do it. There are, of course, a lot of professions where the education track and the amount you spend on education is really independent of what you of the success you can have in that profession. I mean, whether it's if you're an actor or something, whether you went to acting school I don't know what the correlation is in earnings there. I guess I know more in the area of technology and software and so on. There are areas where, the best programmers, most of the best programmers I know have never taken a class about programming. And, and for example, in fields like DevOps, people who manage servers and keep them running and so on, that's an interesting field that is kind of a modern version of kind of the engineers who kept the railways going and so on. It's a field where there are people who have very high skill in that area and have no visible education, so to speak, beyond, sort of dropped out of high school like level. There's some people in that field who it's kind of a funny field because it's often quite bimodal between people who are kind of, just about made it through high school versus people who got fancy PhDs and so on. But in the end, they're good problem solvers and good sort of computer psychologists in a sense doing those things. And there isn't a barrier there in terms of and you get some very funky backgrounds in an area like that. I think, we should be happy, for example, that software engineering never got to the point where it's like, I'm a certified software engineer. There was an effort to make that happen in the 1980s. Thank goodness it didn't happen. I don't think it would have been a positive thing. I think that's that, but there certainly are professions where there is a barrier because it's like you have to go through, 5, 10 years of school or whatever, and you have to have an economic capability to do that, whether it's because you just, can afford it yourself, or whether the system somehow can help you through it, so to speak. But somehow resources have to be spent there. Let's see. I'm told camera froze. Oh well. Well, I think that might be a signal that it's time for me to wrap up because I have something else I have to go to. Um, and let's see. All right, I'm going to make one. Let me see if I can. This is going to be very dangerous, but I might be able to. Let me just see if I have. Now, all right, I'm going to try something. This could be very dangerous. Let's try it, though. All right. That is not a good sign. Well, I think we're not doing well in terms of the camera here. Well, I think that's my signal probably to wrap it up. But wait a minute, maybe we're back. Hold on a second. Something had to reboot. Are we back? We're back. Hello again. Okay. Let's see. I'm just going to maybe take one more comment here from Militant. What would you say to someone who could change the world, but who lacks any resources or academic backing, so nobody wants to help? You know, this idea about I could do it if people would help, somehow I never quite believed that. I mean, there are lots of things where I could have said to myself, I'll do it if people help. But in the end, nobody really showed up to help, and I had to start doing it myself. Now, sometimes I could pull people in once I defined what I was doing, and people said, "Oh, that's cool. I'll help with that," type thing. But I would say that my main reaction is, if you've got something great that you think you can do, find a way to do it yourself or to start doing it yourself. Get to the point where, if you've got some great idea about something, I don't know what it is, but be able to get to the point where you've described the idea in great detail. You've started to implement the software. You've started the organization. You've put up the website that is the thing for the organization you're trying to build, or whatever it is. Even if that organization at the beginning is just you, it still has that website that's like, we are, raising an army to do this, or whatever it is. Or, I think, figure out a way to bite off a piece of the great idea, so to speak, that you can implement yourself. You don't have to wait for somebody to help you. It's really hard often to get people to help you on things, particularly when those things are visionary and out there and not like what's been done before. I mean, I know in my own case, I've been fortunate enough that I've over time, I've built enough in the way of organizations that I can kind of, in a sort of dictatorial way, although it never really works that way, sort of say, we're going to do this. Okay, people, you're now assigned to do this. It doesn't really work that way. It never works that way. Even when it's a bunch of people who are supposedly employees and you're the CEO, the idea that you just sort of tell them to do this, it doesn't really work. At least in my way of management, that doesn't really work. It's like you have to sell the vision. You have to get the people to be like, oh, yeah, that's a good idea. Oh, yes, now we're aligned and we're going to work on this. It's not just, I'll put up the money and then it'll all just happen. It's always a story of kind of getting, at least in my experience, it's always a story. And the other point is, you've got to really define that vision. You've got to concretify that vision. Just saying, I have this really cool idea. I can't really tell you any of the details. I can't really say how to start taking the steps. I mean, I see this with people doing management all the time, that there are people who are just like, well, I told them to do this. And I said, did you explain how to do it? Did you explain kind of the steps that should be taken? Oh, no, I just told them to do it. Doesn't usually work that well, because sometimes the people where you're telling them to do it, they're just like very, very capable. They already know exactly what to do. They've done things like that before. They're just off and running. But often, if you have the vision for what should be done, you're going to have to define a bunch of the steps. It's not going to be that the person, you just sort of throw it over the transom and then the person immediately knows what to do. And I think if you have sort of the great idea that the further you can take it yourself, the further that you can just be a just you type thing, the better off you'll be. And, if you can get it, if you can kind of bite off a piece where it gets to the point where, it becomes, I don't know, a website where people think it's so cool that they're all signing up for it, or a thing where you've I don't know, a variety of different venues. But one of the things about the world as it is today, we were talking about the inaccessibility of the sort of the divide in the world, so to speak, with respect to, I don't know, people who want to become tech entrepreneurs, people who don't, and so on. But, it has been the case in the past that there were an awful lot of gatekeeping elements of the world. Things like, if you want to publish something, you've got to convince a publishing company to put up the money to do a print run for your book. Well, that's no longer the case. It's that's all been opened up. Same with, I'm going to do a radio show. Well, in the past, it was like, I'm going to do a radio show. Well, I have to kind of climb the ladder and, get in with the radio stations and this and that and the other. But now it's just like, I'm going to do a podcast. I can be live the next day type thing. And I think that really helps in taking sort of a vision that you have as an individual and sort of ramping it up to the point where kind of the world can see what you have and do something that sort of sends you in the direction of changing the world. A few thoughts anyway. All right, I should wrap up here. Thanks for joining me. Thanks for lots of interesting questions, as always. And I look forward to chatting with you another time. So, bye for now.